What would you do if your own parents told you at the dinner table? Quit your job or leave this family? Sounds insane, right? But that's exactly what happened to me. My name is Lena, I'm in my late 20s, and for years I worked in my parents' logistics company. I wasn't just an employee filling a chair, I was good at what I did. I worked my way up from the ground, earned respect from clients, and even the staff who had been there longer than me trusted my decisions. But that success, instead of making my parents proud, made them hostile. The company was their pride and joy, something my father Harold always called our family's legacy. My mother Miriam played the role of gatekeeper, making sure no one dared question Harold's authority. And then there was my older brother Caleb, the golden child, the heir apparent, the one who was always supposed to take over the business. The problem? Caleb wasn't half as competent as he thought he was. He lacked discipline, he didn't understand clients, and honestly, most days he strolled in late and left early. Yet somehow, my parents only saw him as the future, while I was treated like an inconvenience. The night everything exploded, we were sitting at a long dining table that smelled of roasted chicken and garlic bread. On the surface, it was a typical family dinner, but I could already feel the tension brewing. Caleb smirked across the table, tapping his glass like he knew something I didn't. Then my father cleared his throat and looked at me with that rigid stare of his. "Lena," he said, his voice flat, "we've come to a decision. You need to step down from your role in the company. Effective immediately." I blinked at him, not sure I'd heard right. "What are you talking about?" I've been running circles around Caleb in every department. Clients are happy, numbers are up. Why would you want me out? Caleb chuckled under his breath, like this was a comedy show. My mother shook her head as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. And then Harold leaned forward, his words like a hammer. "This isn't your company. You're stepping out of line, making choices you shouldn't be making. You will either resign, or you can walk away from this family entirely." The room went silent, except for Caleb's smug grin. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone could hear it. "So that's it?" I asked quietly. "After everything I've done, you'd rather throw me away than admit I'm capable?" Miriam's fork scraped her plate as she muttered, "Know your place, Lena." It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I stared at them, my own parents, the people who were supposed to have my back, and realized they'd already chosen. Caleb was the heir, and I was just disposable. At that table, surrounded by the smell of garlic bread and betrayal, I understood that this wasn't about business. It was about power, pride, and control, and they were daring me to give in. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. From the beginning, I never had anything handed to me. When I started working at the company, I took the smallest tasks no one else wanted. I stayed late, learned every detail, and built trust with clients who had been skeptical about dealing with the boss's daughter. It wasn't easy, but slowly, people began to see me as someone who delivered results. Departments that had been struggling suddenly started running smoother. Deadlines were met, and revenue climbed. What made it all sting was knowing Caleb barely lifted a finger, yet somehow, he was still painted as the one destined to lead. The more I proved myself, the more friction grew at home. My father began to accuse me of overstepping boundaries. My mother claimed I was making Caleb look weak by pushing too hard. To me, it wasn't about rivalry, it was about doing the job well. But to them, it looked like I was breaking some invisible rule, one where tradition mattered more than competence. They wanted Caleb on top, no matter the cost, and every success I had felt like a threat to their carefully scripted narrative. At that fateful dinner, the air was heavy with unspoken accusations. Caleb leaned back in his chair, smug and comfortable, as if he'd already won some secret battle. He didn't need to say a word, his grin said enough. My father finally broke the silence, his voice sharp and commanding. "This isn't your company, Lena. Know your place." The words cut deeper than I expected. My place? After years of grinding harder than anyone else, after proving time and time again that I could keep things running, that was all I was to them. Someone who didn't belong. I sat there, staring at Harold, then at Miriam, who refused to meet my eyes. It was as though my achievements weren't even real to them, erased by the fact that I had dared to outshine their chosen son. I could feel Caleb's satisfaction radiating across the table, like he was feeding off my humiliation. He had always carried himself with arrogance, but now it was different. He was savoring my parents' open dismissal of me. And for the first time, I realized just how little they valued me beyond what I could do for them. I took a deep breath, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. "No," I said firmly. I'm not resigning. The words hung in the air, solid and unshakable. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but I didn't back down. That night, I understood the truth. It didn't matter how much I contributed, how much better I was at the work, or how many people respected me. They'd rather lose me than admit their golden child wasn't cut out for the role. And in that moment, their betrayal became impossible to ignore. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in gradually like a slow poison. At first, I noticed I wasn't invited to certain strategy sessions I had always been part of. Meetings that had once relied on my input suddenly went on without me. When I asked why, the answers were vague. Scheduling mix-ups, oversights, nothing intentional. But it was intentional. Soon, the projects I had built from scratch were handed off to Caleb, as if I had never been involved. Clients I had cultivated with years of work were abruptly reassigned, and I was left staring at empty calendars where my calls used to be. At home, things grew colder. Miriam, my mother, who once nagged me about the tiniest details of my day, now moved around me like I didn't exist. If I tried to start a conversation, she would change the subject or leave the room altogether. Her silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate, like I had done something unforgivable. It was the quiet punishment of someone who had already decided I was no longer part of the inner circle. Meanwhile, Caleb took full advantage of the situation. Around the office, whispers began to circulate, and I quickly learned their source. He was painting me as unstable, claiming I had only ever been kept on as a favor, not because of merit. People who had once greeted me warmly now looked at me with cautious eyes, as though they weren't sure what to believe. It was humiliating to watch years of hard-earned respect erode under the weight of his lies. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, that the truth would surface eventually. But deep down, I felt the sting of betrayal more sharply with each passing day. These weren't strangers cutting me down. They were my own blood. People I had stood by, defended, and worked myself to exhaustion for were now working together to erase me. That realization left me with a hollow ache I couldn't shake. The company I had poured myself into was slipping out of reach, not because I wasn't capable, but because my family wanted it that way. And in the quiet moments, when the office buzz faded and home felt empty, I had to face the truth. I was being pushed out of everything I had built, abandoned by the very people I had been loyal to all along. I couldn't stay silent anymore. After weeks of being sidelined, ignored, and stripped of everything I had worked for, I marched into my father's office determined to get an answer. He barely looked up from his desk when I entered, his expression already sharp with impatience. My voice shook at first, but I steadied it. I asked him directly, why wasn't what I had done enough? Why did every contribution vanish the moment Caleb's name came up? For a moment, he just studied me like I was a stranger. Then, with no hesitation, he delivered the blow. You were never meant to lead. Your role was temporary until Caleb was ready. The words were delivered like fact, final and absolute. No matter how many years I'd given, no matter how many clients I'd secured or fires I'd put out, in his eyes I had only been a placeholder, filling space until the son he favored could step in. It felt like the air left the room. My chest tightened, and before I could stop them, tears blurred my vision. I wanted to argue, to point to every achievement, every late night, every sacrifice I had made for this company. But the flatness in his tone made it clear, none of it mattered. He had already decided who counted and who didn't. I stumbled out of his office, the weight of his dismissal crushing me in ways I hadn't thought possible. At home that evening, I walked through familiar rooms that suddenly felt foreign. Every corner reminded me of years I had spent trying to earn approval that was never going to come. The silence of the house pressed in, colder than ever before. By midnight, I was stuffing clothes into bags, my hands trembling with anger and grief. There was no dramatic farewell, no attempt to talk things through. I simply couldn't stay in a place where love had conditions and loyalty meant nothing. When I closed the door behind me, I knew what it meant. I was stepping into a life without their support, without their money, without even their acknowledgement. I was on my own, cut off both financially and emotionally. And as painful as it was, I also knew there was no turning back. The first night in my new apartment was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. The space was small, barely furnished, with peeling paint on the walls and a view of a dimly lit street, but it was mine. For the first time, I could breathe without feeling watched, even if the silence carried a weight of uncertainty. I didn't have much, but I had my skills, my determination, and a stubborn refusal to let their rejection define me. Not long after I settled in, something unexpected happened. A few former clients reached out discreetly, asking if I could advise them on their shipping and supply issues. They had heard I was no longer with the company, but still wanted my input. At first, I hesitated. Taking their calls felt risky. But when I listened to them, I realized how much they valued the straightforward way I worked. They told me they missed my transparency, my commitment, my willingness to solve problems without cutting corners. In contrast, Caleb's attitude had rubbed them the wrong way. His arrogance, his lack of follow-through, his tendency to overpromise and underdeliver. They'd noticed all of it. And in their voices, I heard something that surprised me: loyalty. Not to my family's company, but to me. It was a small reminder that my work had meant something beyond the walls of that office. The consulting jobs were modest, just enough to cover rent and groceries, but each project reignited a spark I thought had been extinguished. I wasn't just scraping by. I was building something on my own terms, even if it was fragile in the beginning. The more I worked independently, the clearer it became. I didn't need their approval to succeed. Late one night, staring at the ceiling in my little apartment, a thought struck me with sudden clarity. If they didn't want me in their vision of the future, why should I settle for scraps? Why shouldn't I create something better, something mine? The idea of forming my own company felt daring, maybe even impossible, but it filled me with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I whispered it to myself as though saying it aloud would make it real. If they didn't want me in their legacy, I'd build my own. It didn't take long before word of my side work reached the people I least wanted to hear about it. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside were papers drafted by lawyers, accusing me of unfair competition, of luring away family clients, of trying to damage what they called their legacy. Reading the accusations made my stomach twist. Not only were they untrue, they revealed how far Harold and Miriam were willing to go. It wasn't enough to push me aside. They wanted to erase any chance of me standing on my own. The threats didn't stop with legal letters. Soon, I started hearing about the stories Caleb was telling. He strutted through the office, painting a picture of me as incompetent, insisting I had been forced out because I couldn't handle responsibility. He mocked me in front of employees I had once mentored, and his version of events began to spread like wildfire. People I thought respected me now carried doubts planted by his lies. Every rumor, every attempt to tarnish my name, stung deeper than I expected. I had already lost my position and my place at the family table, but now they were intent on taking away my reputation too. It was clear this wasn't about business anymore. It was personal. They weren't content with pushing me out of their world. They wanted to crush me so thoroughly that I'd never recover. For a while, I sat with the weight of it, anger simmering beneath the surface. But as the sting of betrayal settled, something else took root. Their hostility revealed just how much they feared me, my skills, my connections, my independence. If I was truly as insignificant as they claimed, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to break me down. That realization changed everything. Their attempt to destroy me didn't extinguish my will. It sharpened it. I stopped seeing myself as the outcast they wanted gone and started seeing myself as a threat they couldn't control. Quietly, beneath the noise of their attacks, a new determination began to form. They thought they had ended me, but what they had really done was give me a reason to strike back. While working with outside clients, I sometimes crossed paths with vendors who still dealt with my family's firm. They spoke cautiously, often lowering their voices, but the details they let slip caught my attention. Curious, I began reviewing contracts that brushed against areas I understood well. What I found was more than sloppy paperwork. It was deliberate manipulation. Rates didn't line up, invoices were padded, and funds seemed to vanish between one ledger and the next. Digging deeper, a troubling pattern emerged. Payments owed to workers were trimmed down, smaller partners were pressured into unfair terms, and entire sums disappeared into vague operational expenses. None of it was accidental. Caleb's signature appeared on multiple agreements, and the numbers revealed a trail of corner-cutting masked as business strategy. What disturbed me even more was realizing Harold had signed off on much of it, quietly allowing these practices to continue. Each discovery replayed moments in my mind. Times I had been shut out of meetings, brushed aside when I asked too many questions, treated like an intruder in decisions that should have included me. At the time, I thought it was favoritism toward Caleb. Now I saw it clearly. They had kept me away because they knew I would notice what others ignored. My insistence on doing things properly had made me dangerous to their way of operating. The betrayal was no longer just about family loyalty or inheritance. It was about right and wrong. They weren't only undermining me, they were exploiting people who trusted them. That realization hardened something inside me. Instead of walking away, I began to carefully document what I uncovered. I saved copies of altered agreements, collected testimonies from those burned by unfair deals, and traced the money trails that pointed to fraud. Every piece of evidence became a brick in the case I was silently building. What once felt like rejection now fueled a mission. They thought casting me out would silence me, but it had given me freedom to expose the truth. And for the first time, I felt the sharp edge of purpose cutting through the pain. They hadn't just betrayed me, they had betrayed everyone who had placed their trust in them. Now it was my turn to act. I knew I couldn't rush. If I wanted the truth to matter, it had to be undeniable. Every evening, I sat at my small kitchen table with piles of papers, contracts, and notes spread out in front of me. I organized everything carefully, misfiled invoices, duplicate charges, and statements from partners who had been taken advantage of. Bit by bit, the picture grew clearer, and the weight of what I held in my hands became undeniable. Collecting evidence was only the beginning. I needed allies who could do more than listen. After weeks of preparation, I reached out to officials who had kept an eye on the logistics industry for years. They weren't surprised to hear my family's name. Rumors had circled for a long time, but until now, no one had been able to put proof on the table. When I laid out what I had gathered, I saw their skepticism shift into focus. For the first time, their suspicion had teeth. At the same time, I couldn't allow myself to rely solely on taking them down. I had to build something new. Quietly, I registered my own business, a small firm that started with only a handful of clients. Many were people who had trusted me before and were eager to follow, tired of empty promises and arrogance. It wasn't glamorous. There were long nights, endless calls, and moments of doubt. But there was also growth. Each contract signed under my name gave me strength, a reminder that I wasn't powerless. Slowly, the balance shifted. Where once I was treated like an exile, now whispers spread of my determination, of a company run with integrity. My family had painted me as disposable, yet here I was carving out space that was entirely mine. And behind the scenes, the case I was building against them grew stronger with each document and testimony. They thought they had cast me aside for good. What they didn't realize was that in trying to silence me, they had created a far greater problem. I was no longer just the daughter they dismissed. I was the storm gathering at their doorstep. The day everything unraveled came without warning. One morning, inspectors arrived at the headquarters with boxes in hand and authority behind their steps. Employees froze as offices were searched, computers seized, and files pulled from locked cabinets. The Empire Herald had guarded so fiercely was suddenly laid bare for everyone to see. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The discrepancies I had uncovered became impossible to deny under official scrutiny. Harold, who had always carried himself with unshakable authority, was questioned relentlessly and soon faced charges that stripped away the image he had built over decades. His confidence collapsed under the weight of accountability he had never thought would touch him. Caleb, who had been so eager to play the part of leader, crumbled even faster. Without someone to shield him, his incompetence was obvious. Deadlines missed, deals mishandled, and arrogance disguised as confidence. All of it came into focus. What he had hidden behind charm and connections now stood exposed as failure. Miriam, who had insisted on loyalty above all else, was left staring at the ruins. She had believed in Harold's strength, in Caleb's promise, and in the certainty that their family legacy could not be touched. Watching investigators dismantle everything broke through that illusion. Her silence, once a tool to punish me, became the stunned quiet of someone who could no longer deny what stood in front of her. Contracts began to vanish overnight. Partners no longer trusted the brand, and years of relationships dissolved in a matter of weeks. The reputation they had tried to shield from me was destroyed, not by my presence, but by their own corruption. The foundation they thought unshakable turned out to be hollow, and it collapsed in plain view. As their downfall played out, I noticed a shift. Clients who had once been tethered to them looked for stability elsewhere. Many came directly to me, remembering how I had treated them with fairness when no one else had. My own company, still small, began to grow rapidly as trust migrated to where it was earned. What they had tried to strip from me became the very thing that strengthened me. Their empire fell, and out of its shadow, mine began to rise. I built something real, something mine. My company runs without shortcuts, without lies, and with a team that knows their work matters. The clients who chose me didn't just want a service, they wanted integrity, and that's what I give them every day. My parents remained strangers. There were no apologies, no olive branches, no sudden change of heart. At first, that absence stung, but over time I understood it was a gift. I no longer wake up craving their recognition. Their silence reminds me I finally broke free from the cycle they tried to trap me in. When I look back, I see clearly now, family can be the sharpest knife. They don't always cheer for your happiness. Sometimes they only cheer when you fall in line. And when you refuse, they'll sharpen every blade they have. But there's power in walking away, in refusing to let their game decide your life. That's where peace waits. That's where I found strength I never knew I had. So let me leave you with this. What would you have done in my place? Would you have clung to loyalty, no matter the cost, or watched it all burn and chosen yourself instead?